While his wife was bleeding out on a marble floor, 8 months pregnant, alone, barely breathing, her husband's GPS told a different story. Not London, not a billion-dollar deal, 20 minutes away, in another woman's arms. Rachel Bennett had the mansion, the Tesla, the nursery full of tiny clothes that cost more than most people's rent. From the outside, she had everything a woman could want. But on the night her world collapsed when paramedics were fighting to save both her life and her baby's, Marcus Bennett wasn't on a plane. He was celebrating. And when he finally walked into that hospital, roses in hand, face full of fake concern, he had no idea that a screenshot, a private investigator, and the people who truly loved Rachel were already dismantling his perfect lie piece by piece. He thought she would break. He thought she would take his scraps and disappear. He never counted on the woman who woke up. This story is proof that no matter how powerful someone is, the truth has a way of finding daylight, especially when the people who love you refuse to stay silent. If you believe every woman deserves to fight back and win, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me what you think Marcus deserved, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Because this is just getting started.
It was her brother's voice on the line, strained with a panic I recognized all too well. My sister is 8 months pregnant. There's blood everywhere. The dispatcher was professional, asking for their location. 427 Whitmore Drive, the Bennett Palace in Greenwich. Please hurry, he begged. She's not moving. He said she was breathing, but just barely. There was so much blood, they told him help was coming, to keep her warm. But as Rachel lay dying on her own marble floor, she was discovering her whole life was a carefully crafted deception, and the man who had promised to protect her was the architect of her pain. And he wasn't in London, closing any deal. He was just down the road, held in another woman's arms. It was only 12 hours earlier that I had been texting with her. At 32, Rachel seemed to have a fairy tale life. The mansion featured in magazines, the husband worth over $2 billion, and a baby girl just 4 weeks away. The nursery was a dream, filled with tiny clothes that cost a fortune. I remember when he got rid of her 10-year-old Honda Civic for that new Tesla. He claimed it was for safety. Looking back, it was always about what Marcus Bennett decided was best for everyone. I saw her that day in that grand living room arranging white roses for the baby's shower. 30 guests were expected, mostly his crowd. I was one of the last of her old friends who still came around. I'd tried to warn her that she was drifting away from us, from herself. The first pain hit her then, as she was setting up a gift table. She dismissed it as a false contraction, Braxton Hicks. Her doctor had said it was normal. Then 5 minutes later, another one arrived, much stronger this time. I wish I had been there. I wish I had insisted on staying. I still remember that first day. So clearly, I was watering my hydrangeas when I saw Rachel across the lawn setting out decorations. She looked so worn out, but there was this fierce determination in her eyes. I knew she was planning that shower, all by herself. I hadn't seen Marcus's car in the driveway for a few days. And a familiar unease settled in my stomach. It was the same feeling I got whenever I saw them together. I watched her pause and pull out her phone, a hopeful look on her face that slowly faded into disappointment. I told myself it was none of my business, that I was just being a nosy neighbor, but a part of me knew something was wrong. I just turned away and went back inside. A little while later, I glanced out my kitchen window and saw her buckle over. She grabbed a table to keep from falling, and even from a distance, I could see the sheer terror on her face. My heart stopped. I should have run over right then, but I just froze, paralyzed by the thought of getting involved. I saw her frantically trying to use her phone, her hands shaking violently. She looked so small and so completely alone. Then I saw her slump to the ground just after making one last call. The guilt washed over me like a tidal wave, knowing I had stood there and done nothing while her whole world fell apart right in front of me. "Something is wrong," she gasped into the phone. "The baby, there's so much blood." "I think I'm dying." The phone slipped from her grasp as the darkness took over, her brother's frantic voice screaming her name into the void. Tyler broke every traffic law driving from Queens to Greenwich. He's a construction guy with a beat-up pickup truck, not a billionaire. I'd known from the start he never liked Marcus. From the moment Rachel introduced them, you could see it in his eyes. He saw the phoniness, the man who was too polished, too perfect. But Rachel was so in love, so lost in the fairy tale he'd sold her. And I kept my mouth shut, because you want your friends to be happy, even when your gut is screaming. Tyler used an old emergency key from her Brooklyn apartment days, before Marcus built her that glass prison. He swung the door open and found her. Crumpled on the marble, surrounded by crimson, her face ashen, her breathing almost gone. He knelt beside her, helpless, his baby sister dying right in front of him. It took paramedics 7 minutes to arrive. For Tyler, it was an eternity. I remember the way the blue and pink streamers wilted in the sudden chaos. One minute we were laughing, the next Rachel was on the floor, and paramedics were swarming the house, their voices a blur of medical jargon I couldn't follow. Someone kept asking Tyler about her history, about allergies, and then a question hung in the air that made my own blood run cold. Where was her husband? As the ambulance lights vanished down the street, I saw Tyler frantically trying his phone, his face a mask of pure terror. I knew then, watching him try Marcus's number over and over, that something was deeply, fundamentally broken. I went home, but sleep was impossible. All I could see was Rachel's face, pale and frightened. I kept picturing Tyler alone in that sterile waiting room, wondering if his sister was okay, if the baby was okay. I remembered Rachel telling me once, laughing it off, that Tyler was her emergency contact. "Marcus is always on a plane," she'd said. The excuse felt so thin now, so fragile. I imagined the hospital floor tilting under Tyler's feet as he got the news, a feeling I knew all too well, the world spinning out of control, and all I could do was sit there, miles away, drowning in the guilt of my own powerlessness. What about her husband? The paramedic's question echoed in my head. A few hours later, my phone lit up with a text from Tyler. It wasn't an update. Not really. It was a screenshot, a map with a little blue dot labeled Marcus, sitting over an address in Stamford. My hands started shaking. I thought about all the times Marcus was unreachable, supposedly in another time zone for a critical meeting. His whole empire was built on constant connection, yet he was completely off the grid during the most critical moment of his wife's life. It didn't make sense, unless he was exactly where he wasn't supposed to be. Rachel's dot was out of the hospital. Tyler's was right there with her. But Marcus? His dot was a 20-minute drive away, a glaring betrayal on my phone screen. My mind raced, trying to find a logical reason. A mistake, a glitch, a secret meeting he couldn't miss. But a cold certainty settled in my stomach, the same feeling I'd had watching Tyler's frantic calls go to voicemail. I knew in my gut he was precisely where the app showed him, and he was hiding it. I saved the screenshot Tyler sent me, the image burning itself into my memory as I began the long, agonizing wait. The text from Tyler came just after 2 in the morning. She made it. I started sobbing, a wave of relief so intense it left me breathless. It was close, he wrote, but she's a fighter. I cried for Rachel's strength and for the tiny baby girl, just 4 pounds, 2 ounces, already fighting for her life in the NICU. He sent a picture a little later. A tiny, perfect human named Emma. She was so fragile, so beautiful, and all I could feel alongside my joy was a simmering rage. Her father was in Stamford, while she and her mother almost died. Emma was so impossibly small in the photo, her dark hair a tiny shock against the white hospital blankets, just like Rachel's. "Your mom is a warrior, little one," I whispered to the picture on my phone, "and we are going to make sure she knows the truth." I texted Tyler, my fingers flying across the screen. We had to find out what Marcus was really doing. He told me Diane was there, that she was just as furious as we were. A plan was starting to form, a quiet alliance forged in a hospital waiting room and over text messages in the dead of night. Diane's name was a relief. I knew she was practical, that she wouldn't let this go. Tyler called me while they were talking, his voice low and tense. He told me her idea, a private investigator. The word sounded so dramatic, so serious. "I don't want to be wrong about this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew we weren't wrong. The only real explanation for a man to be in a random Stanford apartment while his wife was fighting for her life was the one we were both dreading. Rachel deserved more than our suspicions. She deserved concrete proof. It felt like a movie, hiring a private detective. While Diane figured out the money, I started digging online, my own quiet act of rebellion against the man who had hurt my friend so deeply. Marcus finally showed up at the hospital the next morning. Tyler sent me a photo of him, carrying a huge bouquet of roses, his face a perfect mask of concern. He looked like a devoted husband from a magazine, and the sight of it made me physically ill. Lucky for Rachel, she had friends who were about to unravel his perfect, curated life. "He said the satellite was down on his flight from London," Tyler texted, his fury palpable even through the screen. The lie was so easy for him. I stared at the phone, my heart breaking for Rachel, who was probably just so relieved to see him. I couldn't stand it. I went back to the screenshot, to that Stanford address, and started searching property records, social media, anything, and then I found it. A public profile, a woman's name tagged at that exact apartment complex just a few nights ago. I immediately sent the name to Tyler. My hands were steady. "Tell your guy to start with her. She deserves the truth," I texted him. My part felt so small, just a name pulled from the depths of the internet. But it was everything. It was the opposite of the helpless silence I'd felt watching the ambulance drive away. Tyler told me they were meeting the investigator, a guy named Carl who sounded like he'd seen it all. He said he'd given him my info. For the first time in 24 hours, the knot of guilt in my stomach started to loosen, replaced by a fragile, fierce hope. I had no idea what would happen next, but I knew we had finally given the truth a fighting chance. It began the day he hired her. I still remember it clearly. Victoria Chase wasn't just another executive. She was an event. The air in the office shifted. I saw the way Mr. Bennett looked at her, and it made my stomach clench. He'd talk about her vision, but we all knew what he was really seeing. I remember meeting his wife, Rachel, at a company dinner once, so kind and completely unaware. The guilt started then. A small, bitter seed planted deep inside me as I filed the paperwork that made Victoria a part of our lives and the end of hers. I'm the one who processes the travel logs, so I knew the London trip was a lie. His private jet. November 787 Romeo. Mike never went to Heathrow. I saw the amended flight plan pop up on my screen. First to Los Angeles, then down to Cabo San Lucas. I stared at the two names on the manifest, Marcus Bennett and Victoria Chase. The confirmation for the presidential suite at Casa del Mar came through my inbox. For 4 nights. I felt sick knowing his wife was home, pregnant and alone, while I was an unwilling, silent party to his betrayal. I didn't see the pictures from the magazines, but I saw something far more damning. I saw the expense report for a custom piece of jewelry coded as a client gift. That cost more than my house. Then, Victoria started wearing a new ring to the office. It was an engagement ring, a diamond so large it seemed to pull the light from the room. That rock had to be at least 5 carats, and the whispers put the cost somewhere north of $200,000. It was a slap in the face to a woman who thought she was happily married. The office email announcing Rachel's premature labor sent a chill down my spine. I knew he had been with Victoria just days before, and the thought of him rushing to the hospital to play the role of the devoted husband was obscene. I wanted to tell someone, to send an anonymous email with the flight records, but fear kept my fingers still. My job, my mortgage. I weighed it all against a stranger's heartbreak. My silence felt like a choice, and I chose myself. It's a cowardly decision I have to live with every single day. The hypocrisy in the office was suffocating. We all signed a card for Rachel, filled with meaningless well-wishes, while he was on the phone in his glass office, whispering instructions to Victoria. I watched him orchestrate the entire cover-up from his leather chair. I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel, lying in that hospital bed, believing a story that was a complete fiction. My inaction felt like a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. Things just weren't adding up, and Asilbe was the only one with the missing pieces of the equation. When he finally came back to the office, he looked perfect. His suit was immaculate. His hair was flawless. He looked like he'd just stepped out of a spa, not off a 10-hour flight from Europe. That single detail confirmed everything for me. He hadn't been in London. I watched him lie to his entire senior staff with a smile. And I realized I wasn't just witnessing an affair. I was witnessing a master manipulator at work, and my silence was giving him the power to continue. He was destroying her, and I was just standing by. Then, everything changed. Victoria was suddenly working remotely, and a heavy silence fell over our floor. I knew the truth was coming out. I prayed that Rachel had found out, that she was finally seeing the man I saw every day. I started picturing her not as the quiet wife from the Christmas party, but as a fighter, the kind of woman who wouldn't go down without a fight, the woman she was before she became Mrs. Bennet. I started rooting for her, hoping a glimpse of that woman would return. His lawyer started calling the office, and a new narrative began to form. Rachel was unstable, emotional, confused. I overheard him on a call, describing her as unwell, his voice full of fake concern. That was the moment my fear turned into rage. He was going to blame her. He was going to ruin her name to save his own. I thought of her and her new baby, Emma, and knew I couldn't stand by any longer. My silence had been a form of complicity, and it was time to atone for it. I could see his strategy forming. He would make her seem crazy, and everyone would believe him because he was Marcus Bennet. But I had proof he couldn't deny. That night, my heart pounding, I dug through archived expense reports and old travel requests. I found everything: the jewelry receipt, the original flight itinerary to Cabo, the dinner reservation in Malibu. It was a complete timeline of his lies. For the first time since this whole thing began, I didn't feel helpless. I felt powerful. A few weeks later, I read an article that Rachel had hired one of the toughest divorce attorneys in the state. This was my chance. I printed every document, every email, every receipt. I put them all in a plain envelope with no return address. On my lunch break, I walked 12 blocks to a post office in a different neighborhood. As the envelope slid into the mail slot, I felt the crushing weight of my long silence finally begin to lift. It was a small, anonymous act, but it was my hope for her. It was my hope for justice. I remember the first time I saw it, really saw it. Mr. Bennet, Marcus, was supposed to be mentoring Victoria, our new marketing prodigy. But the way he looked at her across the table at that lunch meeting had nothing to do with business. I knew his wife, Rachel, from the company holiday parties. She was kind, always remembered my name. At 48, Marcus was a titan, shielded by lawyers who could crush anyone. A knot of dread formed in my stomach that day, a feeling that a terrible story was beginning. And I was standing on the first page, silent and afraid. What could I do, though? He signed my paychecks. The whispers started soon after. Talk of an ironclad prenup, something he'd made Rachel sign without a second thought. From my desk in accounting, I saw the truth in spreadsheets. I saw the expense reports for his trips with Victoria, dating back 18 months, long before their daughter was even a thought. It was a calculated deception, a marriage built on a lie from the very start. I saw the hidden accounts being set up, the groundwork for his escape, and every keystroke felt like a betrayal I was committing myself. He walked around the office like a king, assuming his world would bend to his will. The news of Rachel's collapse and the premature birth of their daughter, Emma, hit the office like a shockwave. I knew he'd been with Victoria that weekend. Her travel receipts came across my desk. He was a man who believed his wealth made him immune, that people like me and women like Rachel would just accept what we were given instead of risking it all. His arrogance was a shield, and I was just one of the many people hiding behind it, letting him get away with it. When Rachel finally came home from the hospital, Marcus sent a company-wide email about the sanctity of family, a performance for the masses. Later that day, I saw him in his glass-walled office, a champagne flute on his desk, laughing softly into his phone. It wasn't the polite, strained laugh he used with business partners. It was easy, intimate. He was toasting his own deception, celebrating having his wife home while his mistress was just a call away. I felt sick, knowing my silence was helping him paint this pretty picture over a rotten canvas. Then came the all-hands meeting. Marcus announced he was promoting Victoria to Chief Operating Officer, framing it as a way to free himself up for his family. The lie was so bold, it was almost brilliant. He was installing his mistress in a position of power, rewarding her right in front of us. He said her youth didn't matter, that she had vision. We all knew what she had, and it wasn't just a view of the future of technology. I had to applaud with everyone else, my stomach in knots. I wondered if Rachel knew, or if she was buying the same lie we were all being fed. His door stayed closed more often after that. The late-night emergencies became a regular thing. I'd see his office light glowing long after everyone else had gone home, and I knew he wasn't working. He was on the phone with her. The walls of our office weren't just holding up a building, they were holding up his secret life. A war was starting, I could feel it. And there I was, a quiet foot soldier on the wrong side, watching it all unfold through the safety of my cubicle window. Then for a moment, it felt like the world shifted. The call came down from legal. All assets were frozen. Panic erupted. Whispers of offshore accounts, shell companies, and a conservative estimate of $50 million flew through the office. $50 million. I felt a surge of adrenaline, of hope. I thought, she's done it. Rachel found a way. For the first time, I saw real fear in the eyes of the executives. The fortress was breached, and maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally going to win. I remember the day they said little Emma was strong enough to leave the NICU. Mrs. Bennett's friends were so happy, toasting to karma and new beginnings. But I saw him, Mr. Bennett, on the veranda. His voice a low murmur on the phone, a cold smile on his face that had nothing to do with his recovering daughter. He was toasting his own kind of victory. That was the first day my silence felt like a stone in my throat. the day I chose my job over her. What kind of papers? That's what she asked on the phone that morning, her voice laced with an I. On unease, I knew all too well. I was dusting in the hall when his assistant called, every word rehearsed and chilling. I knew then that something terrible was about to happen. He never needed her for business. When her car pulled into the drive, I wanted to run out, to wave her away, but I just shrank back into the shadows. My silence was a cage I had built for myself. Who are these people? Her question echoed in the sterile living room. I watched from the doorway as he introduced the court supervisor, his face a perfect mask of feigned regret. He spoke of her behavior, of postpartum psychosis, twisting her fear and exhaustion into a weapon. Every lie he told was a brick in the wall he was building around her. And my silence was the mortar holding it all together. I felt like a ghost in my own life, witnessing a crime I was too afraid to stop. I heard the clink of ice as the officer shifted his weight, looking just as uncomfortable as I felt. Mrs. Bennett tried to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't paranoid, that she had proof. But his voice, so calm and reasonable, drowned her out. He painted her as unwell, as a danger. He was the artist, and her life was the canvas he was destroying. I had seen the evidence of his other life, smelled the unfamiliar perfume on his shirts. My silence made me a liar too. What photographs? He asked, spreading his hands in a gesture of pure innocence. He lied about London, about the ring, about everything. He was already married to the love of his life, he said, and I watched her world crumble. She wanted to call her lawyer, but it was too late. He had thought of everything. The system was on his side. As the officer explained, he had to escort her for a 72-hour evaluation. I finally understood my own cowardice. I was a bystander to a soul's destruction. Let me get my purse. Her voice was so quiet, so defeated. They wouldn't even let her say goodbye to her baby. In that moment, I saw the full, horrifying scope of his plan. It was never just about a divorce. He was trying to erase her, to have her declared unfit, to steal her daughter completely. He had set a perfect, monstrous trap, and I, in my silence, had helped him spring it. The beautiful cage of Pinehurst was waiting for her. The house was unnervingly quiet while she was gone. I'd walk past Emma's nursery and feel the weight of my inaction pressing down on me. I imagined them taking her things, her phone, her wedding ring, stripping away her identity piece by piece. They were telling her she was crazy, and who would believe her? They had his paperwork, his doctors, his lies. He was building a new reality, and she was trapped in the old one, all alone. I knew he had fabricated everything, the flight records, the witness statements. It's what powerful men do. They don't break the rules, they rewrite them. Her truth was being twisted into a symptom of a sickness he had invented. She wasn't just fighting him anymore. She was fighting his money, his influence, a whole world designed to protect him. On the third day, when a woman I had never seen before arrived to visit her, I felt the first flicker of something that wasn't despair. I was asked to deliver a package to the facility that day, and I saw the woman who had come for Mrs. Bennett. She was older, with eyes that looked like they had seen this exact battle before. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard a name, Victoria Chase, and then another, Evelyn Grant. The woman spoke with a cold fury that gave me chills. I didn't know who she was, but I knew she wasn't part of his plan. She was something he hadn't accounted for. It's the same playbook. That's what I heard Evelyn Grant say. The phrase stuck with me all night. Later, while clearing out the guest suite that woman, Victoria, had used months ago, my fingers brushed against something caught under the rug. It was an old-fashioned silver compact. Inside, instead of a mirror, was a tiny, faded photograph of a different man. My heart hammered against my ribs. The next morning, I put it in a padded envelope addressed it to her sister, Diane, and dropped it in a mailbox 3 towns over. It was a tiny whisper against his roar, but it was no longer silence. His counterattack was terrifyingly efficient. While Rachel was gone, we heard he'd had her committed for a 72-hour hold. His lawyers descended. They tore through everything, silencing people, destroying records. I saw a card on a colleague's desk for a top-tier lawyer, a fixer, one of the people you call when money is no object. He wasn't just defending himself, he was trying to erase her, painting her as unstable. The gaslighting was happening on a corporate scale, and we were all unwilling participants. In 3 days, it was like the investigation never happened. Ethique guys I knew, good people, were forced to wipe servers. Every file the private investigator had gathered was gone. Every piece of evidence Helena's firm had found vanished. Marcus had bought, threatened, and erased his way back to safety. I watched him through the glass, standing by Emma's incubator on a video call, playing the part of the devoted father. He had destroyed everything, and my chance to do something, to say something, had passed. The guilt was suffocating. I remember the first time I saw her, the day the quiet of our floor was broken. Through my peephole, I saw a woman so broken she looked like a ghost, held up by Diane from next door. I couldn't help but overhear them, the walls being so thin. "You are going to fight," Diane insisted, her voice a lifeline. But later, all I heard was quiet weeping from the other side of my bedroom wall. Lying there, I felt the weight of my own silence, my inaction. I knew a great injustice had walked into my building, and I had done nothing but watch. For 2 weeks, I witnessed her grief from a distance. I'd hear the mechanical whir of a breast pump, a heartbreaking sound for a child who wasn't there. I'd see her through my window, staring at nothing, the weight of the world on her shoulders. The news articles, the gossip. I saw it all online. My guilt grew with every job rejection I overheard, every lawyer who turned her away. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, there was a knock on her door. I wasn't expecting anyone for her, either, but my curiosity pulled me to my peephole once more. It was her, Victoria Chase, the woman from the tabloids. My breath caught in my throat. I saw Rachel's hand shake on the doorknob, saw the war in her eyes. It made no sense. This was the enemy, the one who had taken everything. Yet, after a moment that stretched for an eternity, the door creaked open. The woman who stepped inside looked nothing like her pictures. She was pale and haunted, a fellow victim, not a victor. I heard her ask to come in, her voice strained. "I can help you get Emma back," she said, and the door closed. I pressed my ear to the wall, shamefully, desperately needing to understand. The name I heard wasn't Victoria, but Amber, a con artist. She spoke of a scheme, of targeting weak men, not dangerous ones. Then her voice changed, broke with a fear I could feel through the plaster. She spoke of Marcus. "Marcus is a monster," she whispered, and the confession hung in the air between our apartments. I realized then that my neighbor wasn't just fighting a messy divorce. She was caught in a predator's web. And the woman who'd helped build it was now tangled in it too. I heard a story of violence, of a man's hands around her throat, and a threat to destroy her, just as he'd destroyed Rachel. The apartment next door, once just a space, now felt like the epicenter of something terrifying. Amber confessed she wasn't there for redemption, but for survival. "We both need each other's help," she'd said. Then a new sound, the soft click of something being placed on a table. A USB drive. Insurance, she called it. Every conversation, recorded. My heart pounded for them, for the danger they were inviting in. The muffled sound of a man's voice began to play, and it was the coldest sound I had ever heard. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough. "Postpartum psychosis," he'd said. The words clinical and cruel. Crazy ex-wife. I heard him and Victoria, no, Amber, discussing her future role as a stepmother. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a meticulously planned execution of a woman's life, her identity, her motherhood. And I was just a neighbor, listening to it all, paralyzed by my own cowardice. That night, more voices joined the tense quiet. A man, Tyler, her brother, paced, his footsteps a frantic rhythm, against my floor. The woman who helped destroy my sister's life is now our best ally? He demanded, his voice a mix of fury and disbelief. I heard Diane's cautious tone, questioning if the recordings were even legal, if they could be used. The tiny apartment had become a war room, and they were planning a counterattack with the most unlikely of weapons, supplied by the most treacherous of allies. It was Amber who clarified the strategy. It wasn't about the courts, it was about the public. They were going to dismantle his reputation, the foundation of his entire world. Then I heard Rachel's voice, no longer broken, but forged into something hard and sharp. I want to give Marcus a choice, she declared. Surrender everything, or watch your world burn. Diane pleaded with her, calling it blackmail, calling it dangerous. But Rachel's reply was unwavering. I'm talking about fighting fire with fire. In that moment, I wasn't listening to a victim anymore. I knew they were planning to meet him, alone. The idea was terrifying. I heard Diane's protests, her litany of horrible possibilities. Rachel acknowledged them all, but was resolute. I'm going to make him an offer he cannot refuse, she said, and a chill went down my spine. For the next few days, I saw them, men in dark suits, sitting in a parked car across the street, their eyes fixed on our building. They were his. They were watching her, and I knew my silence was no longer an option. It was complicity. The meeting was set for a Friday. The silence in the apartment that night was heavier than any I had ever felt. I didn't know the outcome until a news alert lit up my phone the next day. A settlement had been reached. She had won. That morning, I finally moved. I took the photo I had secretly snapped of the men in the car, their license plate clear as day. I slid it under Diane's door with a small, folded note. I'm glad you're safe, it read. It was a tiny act in the face of their enormous courage, but it was my first step out of the shadows. I remember the first time I saw the real fight in her. It was after one of Marcus's so-called exclusive offers. I watched his face crumble as she laid out her demands. Complete custody, the prenup torn up, and $50 million. Money she knew he had squirreled away. Then came the part that made my own stomach clench. He was to vanish from their lives forever. No calls, no visits, nothing. He called it absurd, but she called it the price of his secrets. I saw her walk away from that table, head held high. I know now her hands were trembling, but all I saw then was steel. That's when I knew this wouldn't end quietly, and the guilt of what I would be forced to do began to take root. The waiting was the worst part. I could feel her anxiety from miles away. Every shadow probably looked like him, every silence probably filled with his voice. He'd pushed powerful people into corners before, and I knew how that story always ended. I had to be the one to send the text at 11:45, my fingers shaking as I typed it. Documents signed, on their way to your lawyer. It felt like a lie, even though it was true. She called that lawyer, a man named David Stone, who I'd heard was unbreakable, and he confirmed it. All her terms met. A clean break. I could almost hear the relief in her voice, but a knot of dread tightened in my chest. Men like Marcus don't just surrender. That night at Diane's felt like a scene from a movie I didn't want to be in. The champagne, the pizza, the toasts to her new life. It was all so hopeful, and I felt like a ghost at the feast. My smile was a mask. How could I celebrate when I knew what was coming? The victory was too perfect, too absolute. It wasn't his style. He never just gave in. He reloaded. Then at 9:17, the pounding started. NYPD. I saw the color drain from Diane's face and Tyler square his shoulders at the door. My part in this nightmare was about to begin, and I wanted to disappear. When they asked for a warrant, the police said they had one. The detective who walked in first looked tired, like he already knew how this ended. He said her full name, Rachel Morrison Bennett, and held up his badge. The words wire fraud and extortion hung in the air, thick and poisonous. He claimed to have proof she'd blackmailed Marcus with illegal recordings and conspired with me, Amber Jenkins, to defraud his company. It was insane. A twisted version of the truth. As they put the cuffs on her, her eyes found mine. "You," she whispered, the betrayal sharp enough to cut. I finally met her gaze, my own eyes burning with tears I couldn't shed. "I'm sorry," I managed to say. He threatened my family. The recordings were real, but he'd twisted them, carving out his own villainy and stitching together a narrative that made her the monster. I saw her hope shatter right there in that apartment. I was supposed to be her ally, but he'd found my weakness and turned me into his weapon. They led her away while Diane and Tyler yelled, their voices swallowed by the city night. As the squad car pulled away, she looked back through the window. I could only stand there, a traitor in the doorway, and mouth the words she couldn't hear. "I'm sorry." I spent that night imagining her in that cold cell, smelling the despair, all because I had been too afraid to be brave. 2 a.m, a guard told her she had a visitor. It wasn't her lawyer. It was an elegant, silver-haired woman who introduced herself as Margaret Bennett, Marcus's mother. The mother he'd told everyone was dead. That was his way, erasing anyone who wouldn't play along. Margaret told her why she was there, because she wouldn't stand by and watch her son destroy another woman's life. I knew this part of the story because I was already working with Margaret. She told Rachel about Elizabeth, his first wife, who died just before their divorce was finalized. A convenient accident on a rainy night after she'd gathered her own evidence of his crimes. Elizabeth had proof of his affairs, his financial schemes, his abuse. She was going to run to protect their son. Margaret's grief was an old, heavy coat she wore every day. She didn't just think Marcus killed her. She knew he was capable of anything to protect his throne. And Margaret knew the arrest was just a performance, a way to trap Rachel while he prepared his real attack. That's why she'd found me. I was never truly working for Marcus. I was Margaret's eyes and ears, gathering documents and proof for years, waiting for the moment we could finally tear the whole corrupt structure down. I remember the day she first came to the office, so full of light. He introduced her as his fiancée, Rachel, and we all saw how he looked at her. But it wasn't long before the light started to dim, a sharp word in a meeting, a dismissive gesture in the hall, small things I told myself were nothing. Then came the news of her arrest. For 72 hours, I felt sick with guilt, knowing I'd seen the storm gathering, but never warned her. When the charges vanished, a part of me hoped it was over, but I knew him. He never let anyone walk away. I overheard whispers about his mother, Margaret, finally making a move. I didn't understand it then, but I recognized the quiet determination in the few who dared to stand with Rachel. She was the only one who didn't break. His need to win was an illness I saw every day at work. He'd crush a competitor and then boast about it, leaving no room for dignity. So when I heard the rumors about Rachel refusing a settlement, my blood ran cold. She wasn't just leaving. She was challenging his throne, and I knew he wouldn't allow that. He would grind her into dust to make an example of her. Then the whispers started about his own mother planning his downfall, It felt like a myth, something impossible. His power was built on a lie we all helped maintain with our silence. We saw the stolen ideas, the backroom deals, the lives he ruined. We all knew Marcus Bennett was a fraud, a man who had never earned an honest dollar in his entire life, and I had the documents to prove some of it locked away. My silence was born from pure terror. I knew what he was capable of. I had seen him destroy people for less. If I had spoken up, he would have crushed me without a second thought, and my truth would have been buried forever. What could I do? But then I saw her, Rachel, fighting back with everything she had. She made me realize the system only fails when good people are too afraid to use it. I watched the press conference on my phone, hidden in a copy room, as Margaret stood before the world. Behind her, evidence I recognized, documents I had filed, contracts I had typed, flashed across the screens. Across town, Rachel was holding her daughter again, a right she'd fought for, while I did nothing. Now, watching Margaret tear down her own son's kingdom, I felt a flicker of courage. My son, Marcus Bennett, Margaret's voice was like steel, cutting through the years of lies I helped protect. The screen showed it all. Patents that belonged to better men, forged agreements, illegal payments I'd seen routed through shell companies. The whole rotten structure was laid bare for the world to see. Then she mentioned Elizabeth, his first wife, and the word accident hung in the air like a poison. The reporters went wild, and I knew somewhere, in his glass tower, Marcus was watching his whole world burn. They caught him at the airport that evening, trying to run. Seeing him in handcuffs on the news didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like the end of a long, terrible story I was ashamed to have been a part of. He was just another coward on the evening news, his empire reduced to a perp walk. From my small apartment, I watched the coverage, thinking of Rachel and her little girl, finally safe. What did that kind of justice feel like? I imagined it would be a roaring fire of triumph, of vindication, but maybe it was just quiet, an emptiness, a deep, tired exhale after a war you never wanted to fight. I hoped, more than anything, that she could finally stop thinking about him, that his name would no longer have any power over her. I hoped she would take what she was owed and build a life so far away from his shadow that she could forget our world ever existed. The divorce was settled weeks later. She got her daughter, her freedom, and $120 million. I heard she was leaving the city for good, for a place like Vermont. A farmhouse, a quiet life, a world away from the one she'd known with him. I pictured her loading that moving truck, leaving the city that had chewed her up and spit her out. A part of me was jealous. She was getting a clean slate, a place where no one knew her story, where she was just a mom named Rachel. Her friends were there, hugging her, promising to visit. I was just a ghost from her past, one of the many faces in the background of her nightmare. As she drove away, with her daughter safe in the back, I hoped that new road would lead her to a peace she deserved, a future that was all her own. For the first time, thinking of her, I didn't feel guilt. I felt a sliver of hope. I sometimes imagined her new life, a porch in Vermont, a setting sun, a little girl laughing in the yard chasing fireflies, a daughter who would grow up knowing nothing of the monster her father was. I knew Rachel was too good to be tainted by his money or his legacy. She stayed in touch with her real family, but she was building her own world now. She was a teacher, they said, Mrs. Morrison, someone who helped kids who felt lost, who knew what it was like to be an underdog. Her students would never know the battle she'd won, the giant she'd slain. They would only know her kindness. Her strength wasn't in the money or the fame she escaped. It was in the quiet, normal life she chose to build from the ashes. She chose coupons and a normal car over nannies and a life of luxury. That was the real Rachel, the one I saw for a fleeting moment before he tried to extinguish her light. That was the woman who had won. After the company collapsed, I found a new job, a quiet administrative post in a different firm. The trial was all over the news. I followed every detail, holding my breath. Then the verdict came down. Guilty. I sat in my car after work, listening to the report on the radio. 25 years. A lifetime. Justice had been served, but the weight of my silence still felt heavy. I thought of the things I knew, the evidence I had kept hidden out of fear. It was the right outcome, but it wasn't my victory. It was hers and Margaret's. The verdict was a closed door. Guilty, 25 years. The news said his mother testified. A final, heartbreaking act of justice. I read that she hoped Rachel had found peace, that she was stronger than she knew. I prayed it was true. I put the past away, deleted the old files from my mind, and tried to move on. Marcus Bennett was a ghost, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone else. My secret role in his empire was buried. Then, 6 months later, at my new job, a piece of mail came across my desk. It was an International Express envelope with no return address, intended for one of the firm's shadier clients. Company policy was to open and log all incoming packages. I didn't think twice about it. The package was addressed to an alias, a name I knew was connected to Marcus's old network. Inside, there was nothing but a photograph and a packing slip. My blood ran cold. It was him, standing on a tropical beach, looking smug, holding a baby. He wasn't in prison. He wasn't gone. On the back, a handwritten message meant for an accomplice. See you soon. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was my chance, my one moment to undo years of cowardice. With trembling hands, I put the photo in a new envelope. I didn't sign my name. I just wrote, "For Rachel Morrison, care of David Stone," and dropped it in a mailbox on my way home. It was a small act, a whisper after years of silence, but this time, I knew it would be heard. I still remember when Margaret told me he was gone. An incident during a prison transport 3 weeks ago. He had help, of course. He'd been planning his escape for months. Now he was a ghost, vanished to some country with no extradition treaty. The ground gave way all over again, but then Margaret showed me the photo he'd sent Rachel. A picture of Emma playing, a threat that said, "I'm always watching." He wanted her to live in fear, to spend her life hiding. But I knew Rachel. I knew that fear would only forge her into something stronger. She called her brother, Tyler, and told him to come to Vermont. Her voice was like iron. "Marcus is out," she said. "He sent me a message." There was no panic, just resolve. She told him to pack for a long stay. I saw it then. The woman from the restaurant, the one with steel in her spine, was back. The old Rachel would have run, would have tried to build a new life in the shadows. But he had taken everything from her, and in doing so, had taken her fear as well. She had survived every single thing he'd thrown at her. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was ready for a war, and I knew I had to deliver the final weapon. The box Margaret had given her was full of insurance, proof of other crimes, other lives he'd ruined. But there was one piece missing, a digital ledger I had copied from his private server before I left. It connected everything, implicating partners he couldn't afford to lose. My hand shook as I uploaded the encrypted file and sent it to Rachel's new legal team. It was a small act in a war full of giants, but it was mine. The fairy tale was long dead, but for the first time in a very long time, I had hope that this story, at least, would have a just ending. But they weren't as thorough as they thought. In the frenzy, they overlooked the old server backup tapes in off-site storage, the ones from before the data purge, the ones I still had access to. That night, I made a copy. I put it in a plain envelope, no return address, and mailed it to a reporter known for taking down men like Marcus. It was a small act, a whisper after years of silence. But as I dropped it in the mailbox, I thought of Rachel and her daughter. The war for their future was just beginning, and I had finally chosen a side. Every person who has ever been made to doubt their own sanity needed to see her fight. Every mother who has shielded her child from the impossible needed to know this kind of victory was real. Rachel didn't just survive. She wrote the book on how to fight back when the system is against you. And that's where my silence finally ended. I started digging through old messages, looking for anything. I found it. An email she'd sent me years before. A note from him, dripping with the fake charm that fooled us all. I handed it over to her lawyer. It was my small act, my proof that I was finally done just watching. That memory haunted me for weeks until I couldn't bear the silence anymore. I had seen him leave that morning, not for the airport, but in a car with his assistant, Jennifer. My doorbell camera had recorded everything. I finally sent the video file to her brother Tyler with a simple note. I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner. It was a small act, a digital whisper, but it was the truth, and I knew she deserved the truth. It's terrifying to step forward, but sometimes one person's voice is all it takes to make sure the right story gets told. A story of survival, not of deceit. And if this reaches anyone who feels stuck in silence, know that your voice has power. Even if it starts as a whisper, it's a lesson I learned far too late. That single piece of evidence changed everything. It gave Rachel the strength and the proof she needed to fight back. My regret will always be there, but now it's mixed with a little bit of hope for her baby, and for the truth that finally came to light. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.